Alright, so hello and welcome back. So today we have finished the Epic History TV Napoleon series, all of the battles. We have watched the Waterloo movie together. Now we're going to take an in-depth look at the Congress of Vienna that was mentioned at the very end of those videos, and we're going to go watch it by History Civilis. The original link is in the description. This video is going to be broken up into at least two parts, maybe three, but probably two. And we'll also watch part two. That'll be broken up into two parts, just so you're aware. Besides that, thanks to my Patreon supporters, and we shall get this road started.
By the summer of 1814, the combined strength of Europe brought France to its knees. After almost 25 years of war, Europe was finally at peace. Nobody knew this at the time, but the peace that was negotiated here and now served as the launching pad for a 99-year run without a major war between great powers. A monumental achievement.
That asterisk is the Franco-Prussian War, Prussian versus Austrian War. Where they were, the North German Confederation formed out of that, and then the North German Confederation attacks France in the Franco-Prussian War, and then becomes the German Empire. So besides those two big ones, we also have Schleswig-Holstein incident. We also have a lot of other minor wars. We have the Italian Unification also on top of there. So, yeah, mostly. I'll just say this: there will not be anything as big as the Napoleonic War until World War I, with everyone coming in on it. I'll just say that there's a lot more major power versus major power, or maybe two major powers, but there's none of this big, basically all of Europe at this time against someone.
After hostilities ceased, the immediate problem was that nobody quite knew what the world looked like anymore. The preliminary peace agreement that ended the war in 1814 restored international borders as they had existed in 1792, with some slight modifications. But these borders on the map no longer reflected the reality on the ground. The Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland, existed on paper, but in reality it was under Russian occupation. All of these tiny German states existed on paper, but in reality they were under Prussian control. France existed on paper, but in reality it was under the joint occupation of the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British.
That joint occupation, it should ring some bells to you guys. After World War II, Germany was... it looked like this, basically. You had a French sector, a United States sector, a British sector, and then you had the Soviet sector. And World War I with the Treaty of Versailles it's not as bad. The occupation of the Rhineland is under direct French control, basically, after World War I for a good while. But yeah, this is basically just occupation zones. And they make sense. You need to make sure that France doesn't do anything stupid again, which, fun fact, is 1814. Napoleon's coming back in 1815. So they will, but this occupation zone is basically just temporary. It's not actually what it's going to look like. It's just temporary.
All that being said, by the summer of 1814, the Treaty of Paris had been signed. The 1792 borders had been temporarily thrown back into place, and the war was over, at least for now. The urgent task at hand was to take this hyper-volatile international system and transform it into something more stable. Most people recognized that the 1792 borders were no good in the long run, because those borders had led directly to almost 25 years of war. The prevailing mood among the victors was that a well-balanced international system was necessary, one that could resist the kind of reckless expansionism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world. But before we talk about the new system that was created at this time, let's first discuss the five great powers as they existed in 1814. This whole period of instability began with the French Revolution, so let's start with France. Defeated, under enemy occupation, but nevertheless, still a great power.
That should be remembered. France is still a great power, even in defeat. Again, we're not talking about a total war here. They're definitely really hurt, and there is no reason to not have a France. Let's put it that way. For if they want a balanced Europe, which is what they're going to try to achieve in 1814 and mostly successfully do with asterisks everywhere, France needs to be a country.
When Napoleon was defeated, the Allied victors imposed a set of peace conditions upon France. All things considered, they were pretty moderate. The first of these called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy from before the Revolution. This brought the 58-year-old King Louis XVIII to the throne, the younger brother to the king that was executed under the Revolution. The second condition for peace was a shiny new French constitution that would guarantee certain political rights. The third condition was an agreement from the new king to leave many of the revolutionary reforms in place. The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime.
Yeah, so before we get to the broken promise, let's talk about this real quick. So these three conditions, or peace conditions for France. Number one, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. This is always going to happen. That was a united goal of all of the coalition powers in the Sixth Coalition. The French people didn't exactly want this, and he was deeply unpopular. But this was happening. And then you'll see, again, Napoleon comes in there and yeets King Louis out of that. And then you have a French constitution. So they're keeping basically the French constitution and preserving revolutionary reforms because they understand that revolutionary France fought for those reforms. And if they took them away, they would usurp the monarchy. So they're trying to have a compromise here, which you'll see where that leads.
The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime. So it goes. The old French aristocracy were allowed to safely return to the country, but they were a shadow of their former selves, and never again rose to the dominant political position that they had enjoyed in the 18th century.
And by dominant political position, he means absolute control of everything in society. There was you were either noble, you were either clergy, or you were the king, and you had power. Everyone else, which is 90% of the population, you didn't have anything. So, yeah, they were a little bit mad they lost their excessive power.
The restoration of the Bourbon king was intended to make the conservatives happy. The new constitution was intended to make the moderate liberals happy. The preservation of the Republican reforms was intended to make the revolutionaries happy. It was a big, sloppy compromise.
And as all compromises go, everyone is unhappy.
And its purpose was to hold France together so that there was actually a France for the Allies to negotiate with. Despite its recent defeat, France remained a heavyweight on the continent. They were the second most populous country in Europe and still controlled the most potent military force in the world. So long as those facts remained true, France would remain a great power. With that in mind, France's objective going into the upcoming peace negotiations was, to the extent possible, minimize any future French concessions or territorial losses. Many European leaders understood that France would need to opt in to any new international system if there was to be lasting peace. Others were simply out for blood. France's job for the immediate future would be to keep the wolves at bay.
So as he mentioned, second most populous country in Europe with the first military by far, okay? Demonstrated in the 1814 campaign, France's military, even at its weakest point, was still a potent force, okay? This military was the best in Europe, okay? Which basically means the best in the world, land military-wise. Now, they are the second most populous country, okay? Now, this is going to change, over time, because again, Germany, basically what is Germany in our modern sense, is not formed, so they don't count as a combined country, which makes sense. The only other country that basically outpopulates them is going to be the UK, because they're about to start their industrial revolution, okay? Now, France, second most populous country in Europe, okay? That leaves them they are, for all intents and purposes, they are a major power, almost superpower. With any extent, Britain was going to become basically the first superpower in the world. But France, again, you can't just destroy them. They have to be in the international system. And for that to work, they need to make concessions to them, and that's what they're going to attempt to do. And France is coming into these negotiations with basically, we've lost a lot, but we're going to try to not lose anything else, if possible. And we're going to try everything in the book to do that.
To this end, the new king brought in an experienced hand to serve as his foreign minister, Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a French nobleman who got in on the ground floor of the French Revolution. Through the revolution, he became a politician, then a diplomat, then an early supporter of Napoleon. Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister for 8 years, until the two had a falling out, and Talleyrand resigned. After this, Talleyrand began telling others that Napoleon's endless lust for war would bring ruin upon France. In time, he began passing intelligence to France's enemies and launched preliminary discussions with them regarding what a post-Napoleonic France might look like. This relationship made him an obvious choice to bring back into government after France was defeated. That's the generous way of looking at Talleyrand. The ungenerous way of looking at him is that he was a cockroach, a survivor, an opportunist. Every time the political winds began to shift, Talleyrand suddenly found himself on the other side. Every time the French government looked unstable, Talleyrand found an excuse to be out of the country. When it became clear that France would not win the war, Talleyrand was the first to abandon ship. Boats. But no matter what you think of him, Talleyrand became the most powerful person in the French government after the fall of Napoleon. And yes, I am including the king when I say that. His great task as foreign minister would be to keep the wolves at bay and reintegrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power. Let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees.
So let's talk about Talleyrand. So we'll obviously come back there. Again, as we saw in Epic History TV, okay, he is very instrumental in Napoleon's complete abolition, basically his complete power. He basically told the Allies, if we remember from the series that we watched, that Napoleon is going to go attack your supply lines. Don't worry about that. Go for Paris. And that's exactly what they did. They went for Paris. Napoleon had to turn around, and you saw what happened. He didn't have enough time to get there. A lot of stuff. Marmont surrendered, X, Y, and Z. He is primarily one of the reasons that Napoleon was not able to abdicate in favor of his son. He, as they said, is either a very good diplomat or a cockroach politician. I go with the cockroach politician version. You can decide what you want, but he, again, swaps sides whenever things get fluffy. So I'll just say that he is a politician through and through. But him being the politician for France is going to play a vital role because he is smart. You cannot say that he is not smart. He's a cockroach politician, but he is very smart. And he is going to do a lot for France in, obviously, the Congress of Vienna.
Integrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power. Let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees, starting with the greatest of the great powers and working our way down. As always, the historian Eric Hobsbawm puts it better than I ever could. Britain, quote, had by 1815 gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power in the world.
I think that's a fair assumption. Because, again, you have... So I think that is a valid argument, okay? And the reason I say that is the industrialization, obviously we all know the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, and they have a lot of coal, baba da boopy. Britain was not invaded. Britain did not have to suffer any damages, basically, in the entire war, besides economic damages from them giving money to literally everyone to fight Napoleon. which they all for loans and subsidies and stuff. They're the only naval power. Basically for Europe, no one else competes with the British Navy. Everyone knows this, and virtually the only colonial power left. I would agree with that. The French. I mean, because again, you have to think. This is 1815. In 1815, I would argue yes, because the Haitian Revolution, right, that succeeded. French power really everywhere was very weak colonially. Again, they will get this back in the 1880s and 90s, and then again with the Congress of Berlin, where they basically divide up Africa. And France gets a lot of their colonies out of that. But yeah, with the assumption that Britain is basically the only one left. Again, Spain and Portugal still have their colonies, but I will tell you that is about to very quickly change, and is already changing in Spain because of Brazil, basically being like, well, you're dead. I can do what I want, and they'll break away with independence, and that's going to start everything in around 1821, I believe, for all South America to start rebelling against Portugal and Spain. So this is a very fair assumption that I would agree with.
The thing that made Britain the greatest of the great powers was the Royal Navy. Sometimes people talk about strategic depth, which is the idea that during wartime, you want the lines of battle drawn as far from your major population centers as possible. In 1815, Britain's strategic depth extended to all the world's oceans and beyond. No country has ever been safer from invasion. The moment of Britain's great victory was also a moment of great uncertainty for the British monarchy. George III was king.
Before we get to this, I just want to point out that, yes, the British Royal Navy, people talk about strategic depth in Russia, the Soviet Union later, but they still lose territory. They still lose people. They still lose industrial power. If you have the British Navy, you have a protective ring around your entire country that they have to break first before they can really do anything. And a land invasion of Britain, a fun fact, hasn't happened since William the Conqueror, and we all know the story, 1066 Hastings. So that's pretty much it. They have unparalleled ability to defend themselves with their navy and basically sit on their island and produce whatever they want. And that's why they're one of the places that's able to kickstart the Industrial Revolution.
And was unable to enjoy Britain's newfound prosperity. George probably suffered from a number of genetic disorders, as well as other things, like bipolar disorder and dementia. At times, it was quite bad. He was in constant physical pain and suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and memory loss. He was occasionally coherent, but not often, and not for long. In 1811, at the height of the war, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the monarchy to the king's 48-year-old son, which made him the Prince Regent. Within a few years, the king was no longer presentable enough to appear in public.
And we talk about King George IV, especially in the 1814 campaign. Napoleon writes to specifically George IV because he is Prince Regent, which basically means you are King of England. I mean, the king exists, but you have all the power. And George IV, I mean, he basically rules the United Kingdom at this point as a constitutional monarch.
Britain's dominant geopolitical position was all the more impressive considering the fact that of the 5 great powers, Britain was the 4th most populous. But the picture becomes more clear when you look at wealth. In 1815, the British people were on average the wealthiest people in the world, at least 50% wealthier than their counterparts on the continent. This trend would continue for the rest of the century, and by the year 1900, they would be almost twice as wealthy as the average European. This incredible wealth and geopolitical security helped produce a uniquely robust political culture, with lively debates and an informed electorate. In 1815, the British Prime Minister was the Earl of Liverpool, a kind of centrist conservative. The fact that he was kind of conservative was a huge deal. It was the manifestation of a seismic shift going on within British politics. Let me explain why. Since the 17th century, there had been 2 political factions within the British Parliament. The Whigs, a liberal faction who favored giving Parliament more power, and the Tories, a conservative faction who favored giving the king more power. England in the 17th century was utterly consumed by the power struggle between these two factions. They even fought a civil war over it. Over the course of this struggle, England swung wildly between having an authoritarian king and no king at all, sending one to the grave and another into exile. By the end of the 17th century, the question was settled. The Whigs won. Parliament became the supreme political authority in England, and the monarchy began to fade into the background. This brought about a really strange period in British politics, something that will never happen again. For more than 100 years, every British Prime Minister was a Whig. This period is sometimes called the Whig supremacy or the Whig domination, sometimes even the Whig oligarchy. I like the term Whig oligarchy because it gets at one of the key political truths of this period. I described the Whigs as the faction of Parliament, but it might be more accurate to describe them as the faction of modernity and industrialization. This meant that Whig political power emanated from cities and business and capital.
And what we just saw there is there was conservatives, they just called themselves Whigs. The British Parliament at this time, and still today, just like America, has a two-party system because there is no ranked choice voting. There's no popular voting. It should basically, do you have 50% or more? Yes. You take the whole thing for your party. That's why there's two parties. And the Whigs and the Conservatives. At this time for England, those will change, but it will always be two-party system.
While Tory political power emanated from aristocratic landowners and the countryside. At the time, the Whig modernist and pro-business worldview called for free trade and religious toleration, alongside a slow and steady expansion of political rights. The Whigs had a general distaste for slavery in all its forms, even while they continued to participate in the business of slavery. So for more than 100 years, the Whigs dominated British politics, and for the first 50 or 60 years, there were basically no close elections. The Whigs routinely won 300 to 400 seats in Parliament, and the other factions were lucky to break 100. With such a dominant command over Parliament, it was only a matter of time before the Whig faction started to develop its own factions, and then factions within factions, and then factions within factions within factions.
You can see in modern, not talking about American politics much, but you can see that in American politics today, with the Conservative Party with factions and the Democratic Party with factions, and then factions within factions. Nothing new there. As we see, it is nothing new.
This competition between sub-factions actually made elections competitive again, and in the 1770s, Britain elected its first Whig prime minister from the conservative sub-faction. During the French Revolution, perhaps in reaction to the French Revolution, Britain elected several more conservative Whig prime ministers.
And this 1774 to 1790 is very important because this is the American Revolution time. So you can see conservative Whigs wanted to, keep fighting for American colonies, right? But they were still called Whigs, so technically they were still liberal, but liberal in the sense that they wanted to keep their colonies, right? Just because you're liberal doesn't mean you aren't imperialist. Those are two very different things, and those will not change for a long time. Really another 100 or so odd years from now.
But they all took great care to calm people's nerves and make it clear that they were all still Whigs. They were all members of one big political party. One was brave enough to brand himself as an independent Whig, whatever that means, but nobody dared go any further. So by 1814, Lord Liverpool, another conservative Whig, was Prime Minister. But he was in an impossible situation. His conservative Whig majority in Parliament was modest, and his sub-faction seemed to be falling apart. 4 men were asked to form a government before him, and all 4 failed to hold the coalition together. The only reason Liverpool was able to get the job done was because although he was a conservative Whig, he was on the liberal end of the conservative Whig spectrum.
So when they mean by form a government, for my American viewers, what they're talking about here is he technically has barely a majority here, but to form a government, you have to have basically 51%. So you need some center Whigs, and because he is on the left of the conservative, he's able to pull this center together to add another 100 here. Okay, if at any one time you lose your majority, so 51%, and let's say you only have 49%, the opposition can call a motion of no confidence, which basically means you do not have the majority, we have the majority, we need the prime ministership, or thereabouts, and they'll call for new elections, blah, 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 blah. Which leads to you losing power. So you need to keep a coalition together. I say coalition, but, all Whigs, right? So you need to keep a coalition of the Whigs together.
I spoke of factions within factions within factions before. I was not joking. As soon as peace was announced, protests started popping up all over England, calling for bread or blood. One publication at the time wrote that, quote, all the triumphant sensations of national glory seem almost obliterated by general depression. Change was in the air. It was not a good time to be a conservative politician in Britain. In fact, it seemed entirely possible that the conservative Whig moment was simply a reaction to the French Revolution. And with peace, the liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself.
Yeah, as you can see, they brought up the American Revolution right there. Okay, there we go. With 1774, 1780, 1784, 91, but, until 1793 is when our actual war ended. But you can see the French Revolution, they start taking over from the 1790s, obviously. And they're all still Whigs, just a little conservative.
Liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself. All of that is simply a long-winded way of saying that when it was time to negotiate with the other great powers, Liverpool found himself politically constrained from every direction. If the negotiations went badly, he could not only be thrown out of government, but the conservative Whig sub-faction could be wiped out forever. The peace negotiations would be handled by the British Foreign Secretary, the Viscount of Castlereagh. Castlereagh had strong opinions when it came to Europe. There were some pro-war nuts in the conservative Whig sub-faction, but he was not one of them. Castlereagh's view was that every British intervention on the continent was a colossal policy failure. If he had his way, Britain would never again send an army to Europe. One of the reasons Castlereagh thought this way is because he was an imperialist. As Hobsbawm said, Britain at this time was virtually the only colonial power in the world. Some of the more liberal Whigs had mixed feelings about that, but Castlereagh didn't. He thought it was awesome. He believed that Britain's future was out in the colonies, and it would be best for Britain if Europe remained stable and peaceful and boring.
He is not wrong in any of that. If he's an imperialist, a colonialist, he is not wrong in saying he wants a stable Europe so that Britain can leave it alone, not worry about it, worry about its colonies. And that will pay dividends from 1815 all the way through basically World War I, because that's when they burned a lot of their colonial resources. And then even in the interwar years, all the way up to World War II, that's when it really starts to fall apart. But they will gain massively from their colonies. And again, as I said, you can be an imperialist, you can be a liberal imperialist. There's nothing saying that you can't be liberal and an imperialist. Those two things do not separate themselves well until really the 1920s. I mean, at least for America, Teddy Roosevelt was an imperialist. And even he was very liberal. So those two connotations, you don't have to be liberal, and you can be a liberal imperialist. You can also be a conservative imperialist, is what I'm trying to get at. It's also important to remember from when we go on here to look at all these diplomats. Okay, remember, he is a Whig, he's a liberal, but he wants imperialism, he wants colonialism, he wants Britain's future was in the colonies, and he doesn't really care about Europe. He, as an ambassador for Britain, or the United Kingdom in this sense, when he goes to the Congress of Vienna, this is what he's going to set. It's not like today where, the president can order the diplomat to do whatever they want. No, the diplomat really does have a lot of power to dictate really a lot of stuff over the monarch, over parliament. Again, he can only agree to certain things, but he's given a lot more power than ambassadors are today. I'll just say that.
There was some hypocrisy at work here. Peace between the great powers meant that nobody was allowed to touch any of Britain's new conquests. Peace between the great powers meant that Britain could instead maintain its advantage and focus on making money off of its colonies. All of that being said, Liverpool and Castlereagh genuinely wanted peace. The British public had been exhausted by the war, and if the conservative Whigs wanted to maintain their majority, they were going to have to show some results. Together, Liverpool and Castlereagh came up with a list of specific goals for the upcoming negotiations. The most important item was that they wanted the Netherlands reformed and strengthened on the English Channel. Two reasons for this. First, they wanted an ally on the continent to break up any consolidation along the coast. Second, this was historically a natural path for French expansion, and going forward, the British wanted to cut that off. Along these same lines, they also wanted the French out of Spain, and Spain restored to its previous borders under its previous monarch. Castlereagh also had instructions to make sure that the new peace deal would keep Italy free from French influence. Historically, every time the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful. No more.
So they want a stable Netherlands. Now, again, we're just going to look at this map for a minute. As you can see, the Netherlands is kind of a mess right now, and the parts of Belgium down here will have problems with that. Now, what I was looking up was basically Belgium declares themselves independent from the Netherlands in 1830, and they fight a war over this, and they don't gain recognized power until 1839. So if you play Victoria 3 and you play Belgium, there technically should be an unrecognized power, but But the Netherlands is very key to Britain because they trade a lot with them, and they want a strengthened ally so that if they come in, they have an ally right here. Spain is the exact same way. They don't want the French to get powerful again like they were trying to do. And Italy is basically, we don't want France coming into Italy and doing anything, and we would rather prefer Italy be divided because if it gets powerful, it could be another major power.
When the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful. No more. Going forward, Italy would be a red line. Castlereagh had other goals as well, but the big ones were all about containing France. Before the peace negotiations began, Castlereagh back-channeled his list of priorities to both Austria and Prussia, and got from them an unofficial thumbs up. At least two of the other great powers wouldn't oppose any of Britain's big-ticket items, and France wasn't exactly in a place to put up much of a fight. The only remaining unknown going into the negotiations was Russia.
It's going to be a problem with the man-child Alexander they have, I'll tell you that.
Nobody quite knew what they wanted or what their intentions were. When Castlereagh met Tsar Alexander of Russia for the first time, he wrote to his prime minister that he believed that the Russian monarch was not of sound mind. It's difficult to characterize Tsar Alexander, because it seems that most of his mental energy was caught up in creating narratives about what kind of person he was, and not so much in what he did or how he behaved. The thing that confused Castlereagh, and confuses me to be honest, is that Alexander had 8 or 10 of these narratives going through his head at the same time, and wasn't particularly bothered when they contradicted each other. Let me give you some specific examples. Alexander considered himself a true Enlightenment monarch, and told anybody who would listen that he believed in a limited constitutional monarchy, and wanted Russia to have elections, and a parliament, and independent courts. Just
hypothetically speaking, you all know, if you studied any history at all, what Russia looked like in 1914. So you already know that exactly happened.
Same time, he ruled Russia as a tyrannical dictator, which was justified in his mind because he believed that he was God's chosen instrument on Earth. These two thoughts are not compatible, but Alexander did not see a contradiction. He would simply switch between these two modes of thought, depending on who he was talking to and how he felt that day. Here's another example.
So yeah, he's a little cuckoo in the head, let's just say that, and he's going to become a man-child, so.
Alexander believed himself to be the most honorable man in Europe, a man who revered ritual and tradition and justice. Simultaneously, he believed that God made him Emperor of Russia for a reason, and if he needed to go back on his word and use brute force to implement his will, that was all part of God's plan. These contradictory beliefs made Alexander impossible to deal with. His positions came off as utterly random, and they could change at any time depending on his mood. He was unpredictable and unreliable and incomprehensible, particularly bad traits for a diplomat.
For a diplomat, he is an emperor, and as a diplomat, it's because he's gonna go to this Congress of Vienna as an emperor and also a diplomat, which is, you don't do that. And yeah, he looks like he has bipolar disorder. But that's actually giving bipolar people a bad name, because he just changes his mind on everything. It doesn't seem as a concrete plan about really anything. It's whatever he wants to do that day, because he's God's chosen.
So naturally, Alexander selected himself to represent Russia at the post-war peace conference. As the most populous country in Europe, Russia was a formidable land power. But that inherent strength was undercut by weak institutions, weak governance, and the fact that Russia remained a technological backwater. This backwardness had always been a source of immense insecurity for Russian monarchs, but by 1814, all that insecurity was gone. Russia had just done the impossible and defeated Napoleon. At least, in their own imagination, that's what happened. The truth is a little more complicated. Years of careful diplomacy had laid the groundwork for a coordinated attack against the French, and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia was simply the catalyst. Had Napoleon been successful in Russia, the rest of Europe's great powers would have just waited for the next opportunity. But when the French started losing to Russia, most of Europe sprang into action. The plan was for every major European army to advance on Paris at a steady pace, but to pull back whenever opposed by the French army.
And we saw this again in Napoleon's defense of France. Now we saw Blucher not exactly follow these orders very well and get smashed or attacked by Napoleon. But again, the plan still holds generally, and he's able to reform his stuff and continue to Paris, so they eventually win.
The Allies knew that they couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but with all of Europe's armies advancing as one, they wouldn't have to. Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if he won every possible battle, the Allies would still take Paris. The point is that no one country defeated Napoleon. Every country defeated Napoleon. But Tsar Alexander didn't see it like this. In his mind, it was all his doing. As part of their plan, the Allies had developed lists of key French towns to capture on the way to Paris. The Allied armies would need their logistical support, especially with several French armies coming up behind them.
The several French armies were kind of in a garrison, so they really couldn't do much, but he was probably talking about Napoleon's... I mean, there was some garrisons out in Germany that might have been able to do something, but again, this is really Napoleon hitting their back line, but they went for Paris, and Baba Whoopie, they win.
Tsar Alexander was personally in command of the Russian army, and once he was within spitting distance of French territory, he abandoned this plan and broke off from his allies and advanced on Paris alone. Alexander later said that this was a matter of personal honor. Never mind the commitment to his allies to all advance as one. Apparently, personal honor can only go so far. It was Tsar Alexander of Russia who took Paris, and it was Tsar Alexander who accepted Napoleon's surrender. Since Alexander placed himself in the center of the action, the fact that he liked to tell conflicting narratives about himself suddenly became very important to world history. On one hand, Alexander styled himself as the grand enemy of the French, as Napoleon finally meeting his match on the field of battle. On the other hand, Alexander still believed that he was the most honorable man in Europe. Spin the randomizer, and what do we get? Honor. Today, Alexander would treat Napoleon not as the enemy of Europe, but as his equal, the Emperor of Russia meeting with the Emperor of France. It was as equals that Alexander negotiated Napoleon's surrender. And as equals, Alexander gave Napoleon almost everything he wanted. Napoleon would be allowed to retain the title of emperor, and would be permitted to remain an independent monarch until his death, ruling over the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He wouldn't be allowed to leave, but on the island, he would be a free man. The Allies were apoplectic. This was not what they had agreed to. This put the British in particular in a terrible position because they had deliberately never recognized Napoleon as the legitimate emperor of France.
And when the Russian emperor recognizes him, because there's another great power recognizing him as basically France, that completely invalidates Britain's whole thing they were doing when they're saying that he's illegitimate, therefore the Bourbon monarchy must be restored. If he's legitimate, then the Bourbon monarchy is illegitimate. So
now, for some reason, the Russian Tsar was forcing them to legitimize Napoleon only in defeat. It was humiliating. When the rest of the Allies arrived in Paris, several of their leaders got up in Alexander's face and went ballistic. Alexander was in a different mood that day and gave them a placid response, saying that it was his duty as a Christian to forgive his enemies. This is what made Alexander impossible to deal with. Today, he was saying that Napoleon had to remain an emperor for religious reasons. Yesterday, it was because of honor and tradition. Tomorrow, who knows? The Austrian foreign minister summarized these events in a report to his monarch, in which he called Alexander, and this is a real quote, the biggest baby on earth.
And that's why I refer to him as a man-child, because of Metternich, von Metternich's response to his monarch. Alexander is not exactly the most stable monarch on the planet, and he's going to negotiate for Russia's. Well, they're negotiating everything about the Congress, and he's doing it for Russia. And again, there is no other monarch there, so he technically is a power level above ambassadors, because ambassadors report, guess who, to emperors and kings for approval on certain issues. He just does whatever he wants, so he's kind of a step above, which you don't exactly want that. You kind of want everyone to be a peer, right, at a Congress or a convention where everyone's a peer so they can talk about each other and, compromise. You don't want someone that has more power than, all of them and can just override them. If he was going to do something, maybe he should have just hung out in a house near the area so that he can advise his diplomat on what he was going to do. But no, he's going to be the diplomat with no diplomatic skill, no diplomatic tact, no really anything.
He continued, quote, "He has started out by doing a great deal of harm. We have repaired some of it, but we will suffer for some time as a result of those things he got up to in those first moments when he got away from us." Alexander's stated priorities going into the peace conference kinda depended on his mood, but it mostly had to do with the future of France. As previously discussed, the Allies had all agreed to restore the old Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The problem was that Alexander didn't like the Bourbon kings. If you look at France's position in Europe, France had an interest in making sure that Central Europe remained fragmented and weak, and outside of the influence of any other great power. To these ends, France had a long history of aligning itself with countries like Poland and Saxony and the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, a geopolitical thing, but Tsar Alexander thought it was a personal thing, and that the Bourbon kings uniquely had a problem with Russia. Alexander's immediate priority was to keep the Bourbon Louis XVIII off of the French throne. He suggested making Napoleon's 4-year-old son the king of France, but Talleyrand patiently explained to him,
"Listen, stupid, we just want a war so that he wouldn't be influenced. So we got Napoleon on the throne, so his son, wouldn't be influenced by his dad to do certain things." He's like, "Listen, stupid man."
That this would allow Napoleon to pull the strings from exile. Alexander then tried to put a man named Bernadotte on the French throne. Bernadotte was a former French marshal who had turned against Napoleon and was single-handedly responsible for bringing Sweden into the coalition again.
He's he will become regent of Sweden. He's prince right now. He'll become regent and then eventually king of Sweden. But him being put on the French throne, because he probably talked to Alexander being like, I am French. You put me on the throne. I have already shown that I, can help you guys beat Napoleon and already rule Sweden. And that would have been a very interesting thing, because if he's already a prince, and let's just say Sweden keeps its thing, he would have been, Sweden would have been in a personal union with France, which was also a no-go for basically every major power except the man-child.
Against France. In the late stages of the war, Bernadotte and Alexander had worked closely together, and Alexander viewed him as the one Frenchman he could trust. Alexander pushed hard for Bernadotte, but Talleyrand wouldn't budge. He and the Allies had all agreed on a Bourbon restoration, and they all saw Bernadotte for what he was, an attempt to put a Russian puppet on the French throne. Talleyrand explained to Alexander that they couldn't be placing whomever they wished on the French throne, or they were no better than the revolutionaries.
Listen here, bonehead, I like that.
The new king needed to be a legitimate French king of royal blood. Alexander got desperate. What about a distant cousin, a younger brother, anybody but Louis XVIII? Talleyrand held firm, and Alexander backed down. An impressive feat, considering that the Russians had Paris under military occupation. A Bourbon king would return to the French throne, and Alexander's dream of a grand Franco-Russian alliance withered and died.
So that's where we're going to stop it, okay? So we will continue for part 2 when I get there. So that should be up on the screen right now. Again, that will be part 2. If you guys like the video, please like and subscribe. And if you really want to help the channel out and recommend videos, my Patreon is down below. Otherwise, I'll see you guys for part 2.